Welcome to Bedhampton Church. Contact us at www.bedhampton.church. But for now, let's continue that journey with this input.
So today we had 3 readings, a Psalm, an Old Testament and a New Testament reading. Clearly, this stage of my training, I'm becoming a really good Anglican. Or maybe it was meeting the Archbishop of Canterbury yesterday that had a big influence on me. But anyway, with today's task, I have been given to take you from the edge of the Promised Land right the way through the rest of the Old Testament. In my Bible, that's 600 pages. Okay, so I hope you're ready, because that is the task I've been given. And you know how I love to delve in depth into the Bible. However, today, I'm only going to be able to skim the surface of this wonderful story that we're doing. The Bible, a story that makes sense. And we've heard in the last few weeks that God doesn't abandon his people and he wants a relationship with us. Jill reminded us that we're made in his image, that sin separates us from God, but the answer is Jesus. Thank you. And we're not abandoned by God. And God's people were invited into Egypt through Joseph. A few hundred years later, the relationship changed from one of hospitality to one of slavery. And Moses was born at that time and brought up as an Egyptian prince by Pharaoh's daughter. And he was called by God to set his people free. And Max spoke to us last week about being set free. And he asked us to think about what enslaves us. Anything that distracts us from our relationship with God. And he asked us to think about how we can be set free from our Egypt to enter the Promised Land. And the answer to freedom is Jesus. Okay, we're getting the message, aren't we? The answer to freedom is Jesus, but it also involves discipline. And our response to the cross is to live a life as an apprentice of Jesus. When we trust in God, he's going to deliver us to our promised land. And I say, having been taken to the edge of that promised land last week, my job is to canter through the rest of the Old Testament so that next week we can meet the main character of the story, who is Jesus. Okay, so today's title is Exile and Peace. And we're going to look at peace in the storms, purpose through the storms, and promise beyond the storms. And I loved that first hymn that we had this morning. Will your anchor hold in the storms of life? Will your anchor hold? Your anchor will hold if it's rooted in the right thing. And where does your anchor need to be rooted? Jesus. You see, it's always coming back, isn't it? Always coming back to Jesus. So, exile and peace. And the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. Shalom is more than the absence of conflict. It's the world working as it's supposed to. Shalom is true peace, enabling us to feel secure in an uncertain world. And our cry for shalom is a desire to express the glory and presence of God again. Although I had some really good bits in yesterday, I also had some storms in yesterday. And one of the storms was when my 15-year-old came to me, shaking and crying. He's a big, tough 15-year-old, shaking and crying. And he was shaking and crying because he'd just had some messages sent to him by his brother, who's 17, who's threatening to attack him and beat him up. And I've got a 15-year-old in pieces, thinking I can't even leave the house. He's already been beaten up in the community. We then find out that's his cousin. And for him, his whole birth family seem to be turning against him at the moment. And he's in the midst of a real storm. And then last night, thinking, him saying, I'm never leaving the house again, I then managed to tempt him out to go for a curry. And as we drove over Hayling Bridge and the sun was setting, we just stopped the car and got out and just went and gazed at the sunset. And looking at the sunset last night, there were some massive storm clouds in the sky. But then there was also the beautiful reds and oranges of the sun setting over the water. And for me, that was a picture of peace through the storms. And yes, we will have storms in our life. But actually, if we're anchored in Jesus and we know that's where our foundation is, we can have peace through those storms. In the life of King David, peace silenced the giants. Peace is found in God's presence in Solomon's temple, and that temple was a symbol of hope for a world in exile. But I'm not going to dwell on those stories because you know those so well. About 700 years after entering the promised land, the Israelites were taken into exile to Babylon. And here we can see peace in the storm, because going into exile was traumatic. The people were uprooted from everything they knew. They had to leave their homes, their families, their jobs, their way of life. And they were taken to a strange land where there was strange food and there was a strange language. How many people in our world today are uprooted like that? And actually, if we see what's happening at the moment around the world, there are millions and millions of refugees. And yes, we can't possibly take them all in, but we can pray for peace in their lives. And our first reading today was Psalm 137. Now, I don't know when Jill was reading it if you were singing in your head. But I certainly was singing By the Rivers of Babylon. We sat down. I think maybe you have to be a certain age. Maybe you're too young to know, to know Boney M. But by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while we're in a foreign land? By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. Do you know, the Bible teaches us it's okay to sit and weep. It's okay to lament. When things are not going well, that's okay. We don't have to pretend everything's rosy when it's not. And peace doesn't give way when the storms come. But you can have peace through the storm. Our gospel reading today from Matthew chapter 8 that Sue read for us, starting at verse 23. Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him, and without warning, a furious storm came on the lake. So the waves swept over the boat. How many times in your life do storms come without warning? Just when you're going along on a nice path, suddenly something comes that you weren't expecting. And what was the disciples' response in this? Panic, panic, panic. But actually, their answer was Jesus, because they turned to him, Lord, save us. When things are thrown at you, what's your first response? Is it to go into planning mode? Right, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. Or is it to turn to Jesus? Lord, save us. Right, you've given me the skills to go into planning mode, now I can go into planning mode. But I've put Jesus first. And the key to peace is knowing that God is with us in the storms. And he draws closer to us in that storm. He doesn't draw away from us. And Jesus certainly had peace in that storm, because so much peace that he was sleeping through it. Some of you know that at the moment I'm spending some time at the hospice. I did a placement there earlier in the year, and I'm still working with Carol and the spiritual care team at the hospice. And there's one lady in there at the moment who I've been seeing who's my age. And actually this week at the hospice, half of their patients are under 60. And so there's one lady who's in there who's my age, who's had cancer for 4 years. And I spoke to her the day after she arrived. It was the first time I met her. And I just said to her, "You're really at peace, aren't you?" And she said, "Yes, I am." She said, "I've had cancer for 4 years." She said, "And I can honestly say that in the last 4 years, my faith has been strengthened. And I feel closer to God than I ever have done." She's living in a real storm. She's got family to worry about. And yet there she is, having peace in the midst of the biggest storm of her life. And why? Because she's got her faith in Jesus. And Isaiah 43 said, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Do not be afraid, for I am with you." I pray that's what we get to know. That in the storms, we know that when we pass through the waters, God is there with us. We move to the book of Daniel. Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah, were some of the exiles who were uprooted from their homeland. But when they were uprooted and they were taken to this strange land, they didn't stop believing in God, even when it was going to put them in danger of breaking the laws of the land. And if you look at the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3, we have the story of 3 of Daniel's friends being thrown into the fiery furnace. But you don't know them in that story as Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah, do you? You know them as Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Because do you know, when they went to that foreign land, they had to change their names. And how important are our names for us and our identity? Yet even though that was taken from them, they were thrown into the fiery furnace because they refused to bow down to the gold image that was made. And we know that they came out of the fiery furnace. And when they came out of it, they didn't even smell of fire. And yet when the jailers then went close to the fire, they didn't even get to the centre of it and they were shriveled up. They certainly had peace through that storm. And in Daniel chapter 6, Daniel worked hard, he was promoted. See, he worked hard in the foreign land he was taken to. And those around him were jealous and they tried and find ways to trap him and bring him down, but they couldn't find any corruption in him. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could look at our political leaders and say those words, that no corruption was found in him? In fact, it says he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. How amazing is that? And those plotting against Daniel knew they couldn't find a skeleton in his cupboard to out him with. They knew the only way to bring Daniel down was to do something that went against his faith. So they went to King Darius and said, Darius, O king, O wise one, wouldn't it be wonderful if you made a law that for the next 30 days, nobody is allowed to worship anything other than you? And King Darius, with his ego built up, thought, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good law. For 30 days, everybody's just going to worship me. And he made that law. So anyone who prayed to God or human would be thrown into the lion's den. Daniel knew that. What was his response? He got down and 3 times a day he prayed to God. Because he refused to bow down and worship anything other than his God. Despite the huge pressure that he was in, despite knowing that his high position of power, he could lose everything. He was prepared to lose everything to keep his relationship with his God. And King Darius was actually not happy to punish Daniel, and he tried to find a way to get out of it, but he couldn't. And in Daniel 6:16 it says, "So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you.'" How powerful is that? The king of the nation recognizing that Daniel served a God who was powerful. And may he rescue you. And we know that actually God did rescue Daniel. He closed up the mouths of the lions, and King Darius had an awful night's sleep. He couldn't sleep at all. He was pacing. The next morning he went to the lion's den and he waited for the stone to be rolled away. And there was Daniel. He used to say, "Did you doubt it? You asked my God to rescue me? Of course my God rescued me. That's the God I serve." And then King Darius got the jailers and he threw them in the lion's den, and they were gobbled up straight away. Daniel found peace through the storms. He found peace away from home. And after 70 years of exile, as prophesied in Jeremiah 29, a remnant went back to Jerusalem. Interesting, Jeremiah 29 is one of those passages that we often quote so much. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Those were words that were prophesied when they were in a foreign land. And they were far from home. And it must have seemed so far away. Yet after 70 years, people did go back. And when they went back, they found that the city walls were broken. And some of the people were content to go back to their homeland and live amongst the rubble. Others were not. And one of those who was not happy and content was Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was another person who was given a position of power. He was cupbearer to the king. And in Nehemiah 2, verse 3, he was before the king, and the king said to him, "Nehemiah, you look really sad today. What's up with you?" "I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' And the king said, 'What is it you want?' Then I prayed to God in heaven, and then I answered the king." So Nehemiah took his opportunity, but when he had his opportunity and was asked by the king, what was his first response? He prayed to his God in heaven. And then he asked the king. So he had that quick prayer for help through the storm. And the king let him go back and let him rebuild the city walls. But that hope of restoration faced opposition, both internal and external. But you know, peace prevailed. Rebuilding peace, the hope of restoration. Are there areas in your life where restoration is needed? And if so, what are you going to do about that? And as we come to the end of the Old Testament, we're getting ready for the entrance of the Prince of Peace. You know the answer is always Jesus. And next week, Jill is going to carry on that story as Jesus enters the scene. To experience shalom is to live with inner and outer peace, the presence of rightness, justice and beauty. Shalom is robust. It keeps us buoyant in the storms of life, and it brings us out the other side. And as we reach the end of the Old Testament, it's time for the arrival of the Prince of Peace. And as we sit in that waiting room, what are you hoping for? What is your cry for peace?
You have been listening to Bedhampton Church. Our prayer is that this helps you journey with Jesus and serve your community by sharing God's love and friendship. Subscribe and join us for more discussion at www.bedhampton.church. All material Creative Commons copyright. Contact us for more details.